Welcome everyone to this event. This is a symposium on the topic of heritage and public space. Just say a few words about the topic we're all going to discuss. I think more so than other cities, Toronto is really characterized particularly by shifting interactions between old and new. And there's a lot of both old and new in the city. Heritage and public space are two phenomena that particularly exemplify that dynamic, I think. For instance, Victoria Memorial Square is a public space from the 1790s, whereas Beta Sige Park in the Portlands is a public space from 2025. The Grange is a heritage building from 1817, while the TD Centre was completed in 1969. The Distillery District kind of confounds both categories by having been laid out for industrial use in the early 19th century and then transformed into a pedestrian cultural district in the early 2000s. Spaces meet each other, they obscure each other sometimes, and they converge also. And what we're left with is a sense of place. As Toronto continues to physically transform, which it's done a lot of in the last 2 decades, heritage sites and public spaces are two things that are repeatedly preserved, lost, and created. They exist in an ecosystem of change. Our ideas about what heritage and public space are and what they could be drive how that process unfolds. So those are some of the ideas that we'll be exploring this evening, and we have a really incredible panel to do that, and my pleasure to introduce them now. Brendan Stewart is a landscape architect, heritage planner, associate professor of landscape architecture at the University of Guelph, and co-founder of PlazaPOPS, an organization that transforms privately owned suburban parking lots into pop-up public spaces. Brendan's scholarship, practice, and advocacy explore cultural landscapes, participatory design in public spaces, and placemaking in the GTA's inner suburban communities. He sits on the board of the Friends of Allan Gardens. Sneha Mandhan is an urban planner, architect, assistant professor at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Toronto Metropolitan University. Her work examines the relationship between physical spaces and cultural activity, including at banquet hall sites in Toronto's suburbs, and their cultural and intangible heritage significance for immigrant, newcomer, and diasporic communities. Sneha is a board member at PlazaPOPS and has taught courses at MIT and the U of T. Jason Thorne is chief planner at the City of Toronto, where he leads over 350 urban planning, urban design, and heritage planning professionals. Jason was previously general manager of planning and economic development at the City of Hamilton, and director of policy and planning at Metrolinx, and senior associate and manager at the Ministry of Public Infrastructure Renewal. Stephanie Ma is a conservationist, urbanist, and circularity advocate who works at the intersection of heritage, sustainability, and community planning. She served as ACO Toronto's president from 2022 to 2024, where she led award-winning projects such as the Oculus Revitalization. Previously creative director at Jaimo Architects, Stephanie is currently a senior project lead at the Incubation and Design Unit of the Environment, Climate, and Forestry Division at the City of Toronto, and a board member of the International Council on Monuments and Sites Canada. Last but not least, Michael McClelland is an author, architect, and president of the Friends of Allan Gardens. A founding principal at ERA Architects, his work blends heritage conservation, cultural planning, and urban design. Michael was lead architect for the transformation of the Distillery District and has worked on heritage sites including Evergreen Brickworks, the TD Centre, Mirvish Village, the Royal Ontario Museum, Union Station, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. Welcome. So like I said, I have some questions to start us off, and then I'm sure everyone will want to jump in. Why don't we start with the really broad one? What do you think the relationship between public spaces and heritage has been in the city, is now, or what it could be?
Are we going from left to right? Okay, I'll start. Thanks, Alessandro. Great to see everybody and awesome to be in such an amazing room. I'm going to let others talk about the relationship in the past and maybe focus more on what I think it should be in the future. So in thinking about this panel and preparing, I guess what I've been thinking about is the shift in how we think about cultural heritage, kind of moving away from, and this is not a new phenomenon, but moving away from just thinking about artifacts and kind of built tangible heritage and moving toward an appreciation for, intangible forms of heritage and daily rituals and how people and communities live, in public space and in the city. And a lot of the work that I do, and I think that a lot of us do on the stage, is driven by thinking about, understanding that we're always operating when we're doing projects. We're working in an existing complicated environment. It's not static, it's not carte blanche. Even places that feel everyday and mundane are layered, complex places that different communities have relationships to. So I think if you're, one of the part of the question is like, how do we think about the relationship, I guess, between heritage and cultural systems moving forward in public space? And so I would suggest that I think about this as sort of a cultural landscape, right? So the way I would define that, and I think we're in the middle of a really amazing and complex cultural landscape in Allan Gardens right now that has all kinds of different layers of symbolic and historic meaning and multiple communities that have a very strong relationship to this place going back thousands of years in certain cases with the indigenous communities that are tied to this place. And a cultural landscape approach to thinking about heritage in public space is one that really understands that we're intervening when we make changes in existing systems that have a lot of existing value, and that we really need to focus on the process of understanding what's important to different communities, and that should be really driving what we do. And I'll close quickly and pass it over just by saying, I think underscoring all of this and how we should be moving forward, and what I'd like to talk a lot about tonight is just how important public space is. Clearly, culture and heritage is totally infused with great public space, but just an underlying belief that public spaces are not really given the attention. I mean, I think we all care about them a lot. Probably everybody in this room, you're here, cares about it a lot. But I just have this really deep belief that public space is such an important underpinning of our culture. And when we think about the future and how we're hopefully going to be able to confront all of the complex challenges we face, I think public space is one of the most important ways to inoculate and create the culture that can deal with the future.
Oh, okay, I'll go really quickly, but I'll say public space is the big thing. That's where civil society lives, in public space, and we've got to really protect it. And you've got to look at other countries and figure out public space is a political thing. It's where we can stand up and be proud of ourselves. We can be human with each other. Public space is really important. Every public space has a history. So there's it's kind of the fourth dimension of any site, is the history that kind of layers on everywhere. And every site has history. Sometimes it's publicly acknowledged, but you can always look at everywhere you live, any street you live on, and there's a history there.
I think it's interesting that right now, especially, I think both heritage and public space are both at risk. We're losing a lot of heritage spaces. We're losing access to a lot of public spaces. There's a lot of conversations about how there aren't enough third spaces in the city where people can go to hang out and gather for free. So I think they're both at risk, and I think there's an opportunity then for them to work together to amplify each other and support each other. And I think for us to be able to do that successfully, we also need to be thinking about who has access to heritage and heritage sites and who has access to public space. Obviously, by the name of public space, the idea is everyone. And I think we can think a bit more critically is everyone actually being welcomed into public spaces? And I think heritage can have a role, if applied critically, to help ensure that the stories of all different communities throughout Canada have been told through public space.
I'll go next, and I'll say I was a bit intrigued when I first saw the invitation to this event, because I'm used to thinking of like, okay, if you want to talk about heritage, you go to the heritage event. If you want to talk about public space, you go to like a parks and public space event. I'm not, not a lot of examples of where those kind of two conversations are brought together, which I think is quite interesting about this session. And I will say I came as much to listen to these folks as I did just to talk myself. To your question about, the sort of recent past, I think they've often thought about as siloed aspects of the city, and how you approach them from a planning standpoint or a professional standpoint was very siloed. There are certain people who deal with the public space, and there are certain people who deal with the heritage and the heritage buildings, and never the twain shall meet. What I've enjoyed a lot in more recent years is I think we're getting a growing number of examples in this city and in others of where these things are just being much more thought about as an integrated whole. Because I know when you talk to people who aren't in the profession, they don't speak when they're talking about heritage and what's special about a place. It's rare that they're saying, oh, it's because of the lovely Romanesque, blah, 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 blah. They just like the space and the place and the way it makes them feel and how it all works together. And I think it's maybe taken the professions a little while to catch up to where the most people and residents already were.
I think for me, a big part of where heritage and public space come together is that both of them really contribute to our kind of mental map of cities and how we see the city and how we perceive it, where we make memories, where a lot of communities feel like they can foster a sense of belonging. And I think heritage and public space both have a big role to play in that. And I'm curious to see where this conversation goes, but I think for me that's a very, very clear connection. But like Jason said, in planning, a lot of the times they're very separate. We think about public space as a completely different entity from heritage planning. But yeah, to me, it's like one of those very, very critical connections is collective kind of culture, thinking about memory making, sense of belonging, place attachment, and all of that good stuff.
Thanks, everyone. You mentioned intangible heritage, or a few of you did. It's kind of a running theme, and I knew that would loom large in this conversation tonight. And I wonder, it seems to me that access to spaces could itself be considered a heritage value. I wonder what you think of that and the ways in which intangible heritage values interplay with public spaces. And it would also be interesting to hear, as a kind of devil's advocate position, like, are there public spaces that don't have heritage value? Like, what's material about distinguishing them at a certain point? Take that anywhere you like.
I'll give a shot at that. I think it's interesting that historically, when we started this 200 years ago, we started looking at heritage things. We looked only at ancient monuments. And then after a while, it was like ancient monuments and other stuff, and then other stuff. And then it's Niagara-on-the-Lake, because the whole village is historic. And so it's a shift, and it's a gradual widening of the context. So in 1912 or 13, the Church of England was going to demolish all the Georgian churches, Hawksmoor and Christopher Wren, because they weren't old enough. So now we look at things and sort of say, wait a minute, these things, we look at things much more progressively, and we're looking at very recent things. Honest Ed sign, there was a big fight over Honest Ed sign. And so we're looking at things much more, it's almost as if heritage is an environmental issue now. It's about the context of where you live, and it's about the air you breathe. All those things have a kind of heritage context to them. And unfortunately, we have a Heritage Act, which is going absolutely the opposite direction. It's binary. It's either heritage or not heritage. It's heritage or not heritage. And there used to be a listing system, which is now kind of falling apart because there was an ability to kind of put some things on the heritage inventory at the city, which were potentially had some heritage value. Now it has to be, is it heritage or is it not heritage? And that binary system is quite destructive to the whole process about how we look at things. So intangible things, it's very difficult to get intangible things that you get a sense of a place, you get a history of a place, or Natalie was here talking about Indigenous culture. There's very few tangible Indigenous references to in the city of Toronto that you could designate under the Heritage Act. And so there's a real discussion we need to have about how to broaden this aspect of heritage being something much broader. It's much more tied to urban design. than it is to actually specific old buildings.
Yeah, and I would just say that's an issue we bump up against a lot in city planning, and just thinking of a couple of very recent initiatives doing kind of like, it began as planning studies around places like Kensington and places like Chinatown and places like Little Jamaica and Church and Wellesley, and this heritage comes up a lot when you're out talking to communities, but when you ask them what does that mean, it's typically not the bricks and mortar, it's typically not the building. I was in some conversations and it was like, well, the heritage is like, that's my barbershop, and that was my dad's barbershop, and that's always been a barbershop. That's the heritage to protect. And then as the planner, to Michael's point, you kind of look in your toolbox of heritage tools that you have to work with, and it's like, I don't have anything in that toolbox that deals with what the community actually values in the space. And I think it is this, it is an issue in terms of the regulatory, statutory tools we have not necessarily being in alignment all the time with the kind of actual stories we're trying to protect and celebrate.
Yeah, sure.
I think since you brought up the Ontario Heritage Act, something that was very eye-opening for me in terms of addressing this, in that you're trying to figure out how intangible heritage can be shown through tangible elements of our built environment, was I had the honor of getting to work with the Trondequachin First Nation in the Yukon. And if you haven't yet and you work in heritage or just interested in this topic, I really encourage you to read the Trondequachin's First Nation Heritage Act and read it side by side with the Ontario Heritage Act. It's completely different. And even when you're reading it, trying to understand how you would actually apply that, an example that was shared with me with the Trondequachin's Heritage Department was there is a building that wasn't particularly old, wasn't what we would probably think of as like a beautiful historic building. It was essentially an industrial fishing shack. And it was a very significant building to the community, not old, but because it had such a big role to play in their economic recent growth. And unfortunately, it was in a state that wasn't repairable, and so that didn't mean they were just going to demolish it. They looked at doing interviews of the people who worked in the building to document the oral histories and the storytelling. They did a 3D scan of the building to document those stories also virtually, and then they'll actually be dismantling or deconstructing the building and either reusing materials from that building in the new building or handing out pieces of that building to community members who worked in that building. And I think that's just for me, was a really eye-opening, beautiful example of how something that's intangibly valuable to the community can still be shared through the story of the building.
Yeah.
I think that's such a good point. I think most intangible culture and heritage is still tied to place, but a lot of times those places are not necessarily beautiful colonial buildings that we're used to thinking of as heritage buildings. And a lot of my research, I look at strip plazas in Scarborough that we work on in PlazaPOPS, and I look at banquet halls in employment lands, which are kind of industrial areas in the outskirts of Toronto. And those buildings are not heritage buildings as we kind of currently understand heritage under the Ontario Heritage Act, but they're very critical to communities who use those spaces to carry out their cultural traditions, pass on those traditions to future generations. And I think the kind of bridge needs to happen where we conserve those spaces not as the brick and mortar, but actually as spaces that can continue to foster those practices, those traditions, even if that means negotiating with new developers to have banquet halls within new developments, which is not currently a heritage planning tool, but how do we kind of bring all of the tools we have as planners into our conversation to make sure that these places, which are connected to the intangible culture and heritage of our communities, get preserved for the future.
I'm just thinking back to the question and all the interesting directions it's gone in. You were asking Alessandro about the links between access to heritage and whether access is a heritage value unto itself, and then all these ideas about intangible versus tangible heritage. And I think they're all interrelated, these aspects of the question. But maybe I'll focus a little bit just on the access piece. Because I think sort of a starting point of this whole conversation is the belief that obviously there's there's value with heritage. Obviously, it's complex. It's a question of whose heritage. We may connect to different forms of heritage and find symbolic meaning in different things, especially in a really cosmopolitan, multicultural society. But to me, these questions are really questions about justice, and because I think we all believe that there's obviously value here, and so when people don't have access to that, it's there's less access to opportunity, and I think with public space, and when we think, like, a big framework for thinking about all of this in my mind is ideas about flourishing. How do we create an environment that we can flourish in as individuals, and as communities, and broadly as a society? And intangible and tangible heritage, plays a role in contributing to being able to flourish in different ways. And so if you don't have access to it, because it's physically inaccessible, or because maybe there are all kinds of psychological barriers, or there's trauma associated with the place, and you're not able to access the value that's there for some communities, all of these things are part of how we have to think about this. So I think I would just leave this part of my comments to suggest that there's this justice dimension to all of this, and that I think access to public space and the cultural value of public space is really a question. It should be a human right. Lots of thinkers have thought about this. I'm thinking of Lefebvre and the right to the city, and that's really an idea about that we should have a right to access other people, and we should have a right to engage in the process of creating the spaces that we inhabit and shaping their future and all of that. So those ideas remain super relevant, I think.
Yeah, amazing. And I think the theme of all those answers was sort of policy. There's a gap between the way we're valuing things and the way that policy works in these spaces. With the Little Jamaica example, with the strip malls, there's value to the space. It's just unclear how, in terms of legislation, you tie that to the physical nature of the building. Mm-hmm. It's a hard question. It's sort of the frontier of the field that we're all in. So I wonder, but any ideas that you have on that, or how things should evolve? I know it's difficult, but love to hear them.
I do think it's a bit of the frontier, as you said, the frontier of the sort of the profession and the journey that we're on. Because I don't have a specific answer in terms of, is there something you could do within a Heritage Act that kind of gets more at the use of the space, the kinds of as opposed to just the bricks and mortar. But even looking beyond those tools, if we look at the planning tools we have, there's many things we can do on the residential side around, it's come and gone, but the rent controls, rental replacement policies, these kinds of anti-displacement policies, there's a few more things you can do on the residential side, very little on the commercial side. And yet, I think a lot of the things that people find really important in their communities is, as I said earlier, it's the barber shop, it's that restaurant, it's that food shop, it's the music venue, it's these kinds of things. We don't have a lot of tools at our disposal to kind of deal with that. I would say another area that I know I'm quite interested in, and we're doing some work on, is just looking like when you're designing the new, how do you design the new to at least, hopefully welcome back what was there before, at minimum, make it not impossible for what was there before to come back. And some of that is a design question, some of that is an architecture question, that I think is quite important as well. Yeah.
I'd suggest there's a role for the Conservancy, Architecture Conservancy, because I think politically and our legal system doesn't leave a lot of it, there's not a lot in the toolbox. So for example, to protect a use or to ensure that a gallery can stay where it is or a music venue can stay where it is, those things, it's almost impossible for the city to make that happen. And we can thank Doug Ford in part for that, because he's really screwed around with us. But there's always a fundamental problem with how do you maintain, if you want to protect Kensington Market, you can protect Kensington Market, but you can't ensure that the cheese shop is going to stay, or that they're going to sell cheese at a good price or anything like that. So I think there's a real need to think about use, and I think there's a really interesting example in St. Petersburg, where in Russia they have very little ability to have any political say in anything. There's a group in St. Petersburg that's going around and restoring the lobbies of old apartment buildings. And it's their way of being socially active. And they're actually using heritage conservation as a way to show respect and dignity for what their built environment's like, and to do things. And so, for example, even in Allan Gardens, we've started a whole series of programming like this kind of event, taking a space that had one single purpose and creating new variety of uses here. That's the kind of thing that it's social activism. It's people doing stuff, people not relying on the government to do everything for them. People not sort of saying, well, you should be doing this, you should be doing that. Actually, people can take a big role in understanding what the values of their neighborhood are and how to encourage the retention of those values and how to build on those values. Because there are a lot of sense of things that can't be protected under the Heritage Act are patterns of use, like how things are used, how neighborhoods are held together. None of that stuff is something that you really, maybe you shouldn't even be regulating it under the city's control. It should be something that just happens because the communities want it to happen.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think there is the model of legacy business programs, which I think started in San Francisco in North America. And I think that's a really interesting model to kind of speak to what Michael was saying, where there are businesses that are really critical to communities that might be in rental buildings, but they're legacy businesses and they're kind of identified for that intangible heritage value. So exploring programs like that and also focusing on oral histories. We don't do a lot of really great community engagement around heritage in Toronto, and so how can we do better community engagement, collect those oral histories, because right now we're very dependent on institutional archival records, which tend to be more kind of leaning towards the white settler colonial histories in our city. And so how do we build more of that oral history culture, the community engagement culture? And this is not so much a policy, but a process piece is also having more diverse representation in the heritage field in kind of positions of leadership so that the intangible cultural heritage value that's of diverse communities can be represented in those processes.
Anyone else have thoughts? I could move on to. I think the physical shape of a city like Toronto has a huge influence on the way that we experience and value heritage and public space. And the fact of the matter is that Toronto is vastly suburban. Like the vast majority of it is suburban, both geographically and demographically, population-wise. So I wonder, and some of you have particular expertise in the suburbs, so I wonder, but you all work in the city, so it's a sort of facet of what you do, no matter what. And I wonder what you think about how public space and heritage are playing out in the suburbs and how they could play out differently, maybe, because also the suburbs are sort of poised to transform potentially. There's a debate about what the timescale for that will be, but it's sort of inevitable that it'll densify, and zoning is opened up to allow that. So I wonder what all your thoughts are on that.
I can jump in,
Yeah.
Alessandro. So as you mentioned, Sneha and I work closely on PlazaPOPS, and Michael's been involved in PlazaPOPS, and Jason's been involved in PlazaPOPS, and it's very much a public space project set in the inner suburbs. The big idea, I'll get into maybe how it plays out differently from the experience of this project, but just to quickly explain what the project is, it's essentially recognizing that. So picture like Lawrence Avenue East, for those of you who have spent time in that part of Scarborough. These districts are all around the city, but parts of the city that were built after World War II, today the commercial main streets are characterized by strip malls. So similar rhythm to like the high streets of the older parts of Toronto, except they're set back from the street by a parking lot. And they continue to be home to extremely vibrant and diverse restaurants and hookah bars and lounges and barbershops and shops that are serving local communities that are largely new Canadian immigrant communities. And a term that Sneha talks about a lot is the idea that these are, not only are a lot of these businesses third places, they're sort of cultural third places that are serving particular communities in these neighborhoods. And so there's all of this life that's happening here. It relates to this kind of intangible heritage that we've been talking about. These places are really important. They're part of everyday life. And the food is so good that people hang out here all the time. But the physical environment outside of the interiors of the restaurants is very car-centric. It's loud, it's hot in the summer, it's dusty, it's not particularly pleasant. But this is kind of the public realm in these areas. So in terms of how does public space play out, obviously there's other public spaces in suburban Toronto, but these are really important places because they're where people already are. The reality of the built environment here is that the part that the city has jurisdiction over is, a 7-lane arterial roadway and 5 feet of sidewalk on both sides. That's where the property line is. And then everything from the property line to the buildings is privately owned. So that there's a sort of structural and land ownership underlay to these places where everybody is that sort of suggests the public realm here is mostly in private ownership. So right away, the model for making or enhancing the public realm requires different models because the city can't just come in and intervene. It's private property. So the model that we've developed, the project is really about creating a model for how to, recognizing that there's all this life here, these are important places, how can they be enhanced so that people can gather in them and spend more time? They're already hanging out, but how can it be more comfortable and more expressive and sort of add more value? So I guess that's my quick introduction, and then, a thought about how does it play out differently. There's a physical underlay that's different. But in terms of how we make space, and I hesitate to use the word make, it's more about keeping. There's already people here and we're working with them and we want the same people who are already there to be the people hanging out. It's not about imposing a new set of ideas about public space there, it's about expressing what is already there. But it requires this different model of delivery. So that's something that we've discovered in our work, and I'd love to talk more about it, but it's really about process. And needing to develop new tools. And it's part of the same theme of hopefully in 10 years from now, we'll have all these tools and we'll have figured out how to do this easily and cheaply. But we're, I think, very much on the frontier of trying to figure this out right now.
I can remember watching a TV show, this was ages and ages ago, it was Christopher Hume was the journalist, and he had a series of experts talking about the suburbs. And his question to everybody was, and it was a lot of important planners and stuff from that time, it was like maybe 15 years ago or something. He said, what part of Toronto do you hate the most? And they all said, Jane and Finch. We hate Jane and Finch. And it's horrible. And it's 2 cars and it's not urban and blah, blah, blah. And that was a really important point for me because I looked at these people and I thought, these are the people who are going to fix it? Like, this is not a good idea. People who love the area need to be the ones who fix things. And I think if you talk to people in the suburbs, they're fine. They love the suburbs. They're not, it's a different mindset, and we have to appreciate that people think in different ways. And I think if you look at the history of the suburbs, you realize how the suburbs got developed. Some of those were really good ideas. They were maybe too car-centric, and now we have to figure out how to deal with that. At one point, they were much more middle class. And the middle class, Toronto used to be called a city of 3 cities. There was rich, poor, and middle class. The middle class have disappeared, and it's the rich and the poor are in Toronto. And it's a very different kind of dynamic to work with. But I think understanding the suburbs before we come to say, I hate it, or it's got to be more like the city downtown, maybe that's not the right approach. So we need to really try to understand it better.
Yeah, just building on that, I think seeing the suburbs as what they are and understanding, like a lot of the work we do with PlazaPOPS, mostly Brendan and the team that works for PlazaPOPS, is to actually recognize and understand how people are using the parking lots and acknowledging that there is a very rich culture and a lot of intangible culture that exists in those parking lots. And I think the critical piece and the provincial planning statement that was released in 2024 very clearly identifies these like suburban strip plazas as underutilized land that is ripe for development. And I think that's a critical part which we need to pay attention to because they're not underutilized. They're underutilized when we only think about the economic use of land, as in they can receive more density potentially, but when we start thinking of land only as from the kind of highest and best use from an economic perspective, that's when we lose these kinds of places. And I think that's a really critical kind of piece where we need to really focus our efforts, I think.
Yeah, I mean, did you want to say something, Steph?
Well, I'll quickly add, when we worked on the Oculus revitalization, which is in Etobicoke, I say we being ACO Toronto led that project, but there was a lot of partners with JIMA Architects, the City of Toronto, Park People. That is essentially a UFO park pavilion, and this conversation just reminded me there were some very well-intentioned recommendations that were a little upsetting for me when I lived in Etobicoke. Near there was the best way that we could save the Oculus was to pick it up and put it in Trinity Bellwoods. And I just felt like, we're acknowledging that this has important heritage and we're taking it away from the context that it's in. And so I think it's important in terms of access, who has access. It doesn't need to all be, all the cool stuff is downtown. And also, Jason, you mentioned earlier how there's a lot of new construction and how do we have heritage integrated in with that. I was living at that time in Humber Bay Shores, which is all those new condos on the waterfront in Etobicoke. So it went from an extremely suburban to suddenly thousands of new residents, newcomers in condos with no backyards. So it really just emphasized the importance of public space and heritage access in a previously suburban context.
Yeah, amazing. That's hilarious.
It was well intentioned. I don't mean to criticize that recommendation, but I was like, no, it needs to stay here in Etobicoke.
Yeah, for sure. That's so cool. If you haven't seen it, it's worth a bike ride up Humber.
And there's
Park.
silver booklets at the front that are free. That if you're interested in learning about the project, you're welcome to take one.
Sneha, you were mentioning development. Toronto has the most development of any city in North America. I forget if this is a current stat, but I think it was 5 times more than next highest, which was LA. Maybe that was a few years ago. It's a thing that influences the transformation of the city in a profound way. And I wondered, because you were talking about how the highest and best use and highest economic argument is not usually the one that protects public space or heritage. So I wonder how, I don't know, what tools or forces could influence that in order to prioritize capital of other types than financial capital.
You're looking at me.
I don't know. Anybody can. These are hard questions. I admit it, but
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a clear answer, but I think starting to incorporate social value into those conversations, and I think the city as a kind of mediator and negotiator where you can start, and we're starting to do this a little bit, but I think there's more that the city can do, and there is development coming to these parts to advocate on the basis of these were the current spaces, like smaller retail. For example, we have way too many dentists clinics in a lot of our new developments because those retail spaces are bigger. And so because they're bigger, they're more expensive to rent. And so they can't be, they're not affordable. And a lot of times why strip plazas are doing really well is because they were built cheaply at a time that they've kind of remained affordable. And so thinking about affordability, thinking about collective ownership, there is a movement in the city to have more cultural land trusts where nonprofit organizations are set up on behalf of local residents to own a lot of these areas. And so thinking about alternative models, I think, to traditional ownership of property could be one of the ideas.
nice.
So I'll mention a couple of things. I would say when it comes to built heritage, is actually something that Toronto's quite good at and is actually, I think, getting a bit of a global reputation for in terms of how you actually, in a very fast-growing, quickly urbanizing place, still find very creative ways to make the old part of the new. And I mean, we could all probably pick our favorites and also pick the ones that we think kind of failed. But Toronto actually, as of cities I've seen, I kind of think like Toronto and London are the two that come to mind as the ones who have, I think, done the best job in terms of making older buildings part of the new. That's the built heritage, though. That's that's the bricks and the mortar. It becomes a much more challenging situation. We're trying to find ways to kind of create those third spaces, cultural spaces, community spaces within new development. And I've referred to the toolbox a couple of times, and I do sometimes feel like every couple of months I get one more tool taken out of the toolbox. And one of those tools that's taken out of the toolbox is a lot of the kind of financial tools that cities used to have in terms of the kinds of things you could negotiate as part of a new development. The reality is that what we have these days, something known as community benefits charges, are such a small amount that in most cases you're maybe getting the shell of a daycare. Not even the full fit-ups as part of a new development. So we don't quite have the latitude that we once had. Now, I would also say that we have a housing market where we've had very intense unaffordability, and we've seen significant drop-off in housing activity because of the cost of building the housing. So if you're going to try to say, okay, we're going to try to load up every dream that we have as a city and just put it onto the cost of new development, we're going to have a problem, and we've had that problem very recently. So it is... I would say the one thing that I kind of look at where we still do have some tools, and I think there is still some opportunity and possibility, is when it comes to design and when it comes to architecture and how we're doing the floor plates of buildings. I think one of the reasons why we see dentist office and pharmacies and things like that come into these buildings, because we have an awful lot of storefronts that are really wide and really shallow, and there's a whole bunch of design reasons for that. And I think those are the kinds of issues we have to dig into to say, okay, how can we at least create spaces where it may not be the first business that comes in, but maybe eventually we can kind of see a reintroduction of these kinds of cherished uses.
That's a great point. Yeah.
I think when thinking about just the scale of growth in Toronto, there's a tendency in a lot of conversations to either just see it as like a negative or a positive thing, like a very NIMBY perspective on it. And I think it's really important that we move past that and focus more on, is the growth that we're seeing sustainable? And sustainable economically, socially, and environmentally. And so I think heritage and public space, prioritizing those two things, really offers solutions for ensuring that the growth is sustainable. A lot of people who aren't happy about growth, really what they're not happy about is that they see it as, you're demolishing a building and you're throwing it to a landfill, or you're gentrifying a neighborhood and you're pushing out businesses and community and affordable rental apartments. And I don't think it needs to be that type of growth. It can be a growth that acknowledges the importance of the existing context, not just the heritage context, but the value in all of our materials and all aspects of our existing buildings, and building on that. So I think public space also plays an important role in that.
Yeah, I quite agree. There's this quote about technology, which is that it's neither good nor bad nor neutral. I feel like that could be said of development as well. I could go with one last question, and then maybe we'll get some thoughts from the audience. I tried to focus here on things that made the city unique, and a big one is that Toronto's the most diverse city in the world. Whether you've been here for 10,000 years, or your family immigrated in the 1850s or the 1950s or the 2020s, different cultures in the city have different experiences and needs and perspectives and visions for both heritage and public space. So it's a super broad question, but I wonder whoever would like to touch on how that should inform our approach to heritage and public space, which it does a lot, for sure, but just your current thoughts on that and perhaps where we could go.
Well, I could mention something we've been working on for quite a while, which is called Tower Renewal, which looked at the apartment towers. And there are neighborhoods in Toronto where there's enough rental apartment towers, about 36,000 people might live in that neighborhood. And before we started this project, you could only have rental housing in that neighborhood. Take 36, that's twice the size of Port Hope, Ontario. And Port Hope has a public library, has parks, it has restaurants, it has a main street, it has all these other things. You put that into areas of Toronto, and it's just public housing. And so we proposed that more things could happen there, that you could actually have food trucks drop by and drop off food, and they could have kids programs and all kinds of. So we actually worked with the city to create a new zoning category that permit those kind of uses. And we found that in those neighborhoods, they're extremely diverse groups of people, and yet they had no way to express themselves. So now if you go to Thorncliffe, there's fantastic food venues, and there's women who make all these kind of great foods and sell the foods in their neighborhood. And that's the stuff that we need to think about, is actually, I think we tend to, as good Canadians, we tend to look to our government to do everything for us. But I think we need to start thinking more grassroots, and more like the ACO could develop a whole series of initiatives about identifying important public spaces that have been under-recognized, or could take on an initiative about looking at suburban neighborhoods and understanding what the heritage values of those suburban neighborhoods might be. And there are all kinds of things that we could be doing, which we could just kind of get off our butts and do these things. It would be really, really helpful.
That's a great example, and I think that's where we probably first met, was working on those tower renewal
Yeah,
initiatives,
exactly.
and this radical notion of allowing commercial uses in some of those tower neighborhoods. And it was the first time. This is when I worked on that when I was in private practice. But it was the first time that when that zoning was actually passed. This was long before I came to the city. I went to my first zoning party. There was actually a celebratory party to celebrate the passing of the zoning bylaw, which I wasn't living in Toronto at the time, and it just felt like a very Toronto thing. But on that theme, what I'd say in response to the question is, yes, we can't look to government for everything, and yes, we don't. A lot of the tools and the statutes that we've been used to using protect a certain type of heritage are no longer the right tools. I think this issue of culture and heritage in the suburbs and culture and heritage of the many diverse communities that live in Toronto is actually, I think, where this issue is going to come to a head. And I think part of the solution is also just going to lie in well, if you can't fix it, you can at least try to get out of the way a little bit. And that's where things like the rack zoning, I think, comes in. That's where things like more permissive residential zoning, so you can start to have multi-generational living in the suburbs, I think, comes in. There's been a number of things, one of which that my team brought forward to council around actually, shockingly, allowing variety stores and commercial uses in neighborhoods. And we've seen just recently at council with food trucks and being able to have music in parks and on streets. These kinds of things, sometimes it might not be about can we find that perfect regulation that allows us to protect them? Sometimes it might be, can we just get rid of the rules that are making them illegal? And so I do see some momentum there.
I would share a little anecdote from our experience with PlazaPOPS. Speaking of just learning about all the different needs that are out there and all the different perspectives and the way different groups feel in space. So there's with one of our projects in 2023 and in 2024, we were in this plaza. We had created this kind of temporary garden. So picture nighttime lighting and seating and lots of lush native plants and people hanging out. And before we went into this one particular plaza, we were scoping out where we might approach business owners to see if they would partner with us. And there was this group of, I was going to say middle-aged men who were hanging out under the shade of one of the strip mall signs. And they were all regular visitors of the Sahan restaurant in this plaza, which is a Somali restaurant. And it's it's one of these third places where people are hanging out all the time. And we noticed that this group of guys, they hang out basically every night in the summer. And they would bring lawn chairs either from the restaurants or from home, and they would just gather in the shade. So the pylon sign was here, the sun is setting. It's kind of sublime in a way, you've got all the lights coming out on the strip malls, and we thought, okay, this is just again further evidence of how these places are already inhabited, and hopefully this group would hang out in the space. And so we talked to them through the course of the 2 years that we were there. But the lesson, I guess, there is a lot of, in our experience working in the inner suburbs, a lot of the public life culture of the communities that are living there, they tend to be coming from places where people are outside and living outside all the time, and particularly at night. So our spaces have been, they're the most vibrant at night. And I think that part of that is cultural thing. It's a cultural practice thing. It's having tea and gathering with friends in the evening. It's also a microclimate thing. In the summer, those spaces are by far the most comfortable at that time. The traffic slows down. You can get there more quickly. And anyway, it's a minor little thing. And I know the city's doing all kinds of work on the night economy. And I mean, there's Uber Eats drivers that are like one of the major groups that are actually in public space in the evenings in these parts of the city. And we learned that from doing a project and realizing, oh, like every night there's Uber Eats drivers that are hanging out on their bikes, and it's actually a space of labor. It's not just going and hanging out with your friends. It's there in the middle of a shift, right? Anyway, so there's all kinds of different needs that are out there, and some of the research we did that Sneha was a big part of, that was amazing, was realizing that, I'm thinking of this group in particular, the Sahan uncles, when we interviewed them, they talked about feelings of nostalgia. So like when they were spending time in this space, it was actually reminding them of home, like where they had come from. It was reminding them of the Middle East or parts of North Africa, which is really interesting, and that was contributed to a sense of belonging. So anyway, there's a lot. This is just one little anecdote, but focusing on nighttime, focusing on all these sort of different types of needs, and it all comes back to like spending time in these places, right, and really understanding what these existing patterns are.
I'll just very quickly add to that. When I did my research on banquet halls, the way that I arrived at identifying those as sites of heritage was by asking folks. I was working with first and second generation South Asians. This was during the pandemic, so I was literally just doing phone interviews, and I just asked them what they did on their weekends pre-COVID. And that's how I got to the banquet hall. And I think in addition to kind of spending time in these spaces, asking more open-ended questions and not kind of forcing the audience to do the labor of filtering out what constitutes heritage, because heritage is a very complex concept. And if I had asked them, because I tried, if I'd asked them what is a place of heritage importance for you, that's not what would have come out of the conversation. So I think having more open-ended conversations about what are the cultural activities that they participate in their day-to-day, and then kind of as planners filtering that out and kind of identifying the right tool to address that, I think is our job. And those open-ended conversations, like with the Sahan uncles and just the communities kind of that are practicing their everyday cultures there is a really important piece.
That's such a great point. It's like a good idea is something you haven't thought of yet. Yeah, the way that you enter the conversation is really important. Wow.
I think not just in planning tools, but in design, we can be more creative in expanding our ideas of where heritage materials can be sharing stories. In terms of, Brendan, you mentioned immigrant labor and how that builds the city, and that was reminding me, I did an installation while at JIMO with Arcana, who are heritage masons, and we were doing an installation to show all of the brick that we throw away, and it's this really valuable material that we just waste, and we were doing this installation more from a sustainability perspective to show, hey, there's a lot of embodied carbon here that we're wasting here. But something I wasn't expecting was our installation was right beside a construction site, right beside a Tim Hortons. So a lot of construction workers kept coming in and seeing the installation, and in 3 different instances, construction workers there had shared with me like, oh, that's how my family came to Canada as Portuguese brick masons and working and building our cities here. And it wasn't intended to be that, but they felt very seen through that installation. And so that just was a reminder that it's not just a specific space, it's not just a specific building, but also the labor that goes into building our cities is a heritage story that we should be telling.
Yeah, great. Excellent point. Excellent. What are all of your thoughts? I think the mic situation is basically that we don't have any. So if you want to stand up and ask a question, we've got like maybe 10 or 15 minutes to chat. Alex Bowron. You need not stand up, but you could. Yeah.
It's a question for Jason. The toolbox that you referred to, for those of us who maybe don't have as much of a sort of understanding of how planning operates in the city, I'm curious if you could elaborate on kind of tools you currently do have-ish, obviously not everyone, but also how you might get new ones and whether or not there are ways for citizens, advocacy groups, different sort of organizations to support that or facilitate somehow the gaining of new tools.
Sure, and I would say in the world of planning, it's pretty much the province who decides what tools go in the toolbox and which tools come out of the toolbox. Not entirely, but for the most part, the kind of the authorities that local governments have or often don't have rest within sort of provincial legislation and provincial statute. And I would say on the heritage side, where we have some stronger tools, if the intention is to protect a physical structure, and you can demonstrate its heritage value, there are some tools there that you can do that, and then you have some greater controls when development is proposed in terms of, if not total preservation, how you actually integrate or incorporate the key heritage elements into the new building. There we have some decent tools. They're tools that have been weakened recently, but we still have that. Where what we lack is what goes inside the thing that you have just preserved and protected. And where that comes to a head a lot, in my experience, is cultural space and commercial space, where as a government we have limitations in terms of we can't tell you who to lease the space to, we can't give preferential treatment to one private business over another private business. It's all the stuff that actually breathes life into the buildings and breathes life into the things that we're protecting. That's where we bump up against limitations. The kinds of tools that I've seen work in other jurisdictions, and there is a growing kind of movement in the City of Toronto around land trust. That's a very powerful community tool that can be quite effective, but they need financial support to actually be able to make it viable. And I also just think, all of the arguments we've had for many decades about rent control as an anti-displacement tool in the residential sector, can we start thinking about that more in the commercial and cultural sector?
How would you respond to the idea that the Toronto School Board selling schools that have been in neighborhoods for 100 years is actually, an attack on cultural heritage and physical heritage, social heritage of the neighborhood, should be stopped, in addition to all the other reasons it should be stopped?
I think it's really short-sighted for the school board to be doing this. They've also done kind of facility studies where they sort of say, well, the halls are too wide in an old schoolhouse, so that means it's bad use of space. It's actually, people in my office right now are looking at kind of making an counter-argument to that, but it is problematic because they're looking at the demographics right now. Demographics in each neighborhood changes over periods of time, and before you know it, you're going to have all kinds of people wanting, where's the school? We need to build a new school. Also, the demolition of some schools for building new schools, that there needs to be a lot more thought about that. Adaptive reuse of schools is a really good idea, even if it's on a temporary basis to keep them going. So I think it is problematic, and it's something that's, and I got to say, poor old school boards, they have their own kind of financial problems, so it's really difficult to say you got to do this, you got to do that, because they have to work within the finances that they've got. So it's a conundrum.
Yes, sir.
My question is sort of coming back to the physical again. For residents, the physical, it still is important. We're talking about cultural intent, but yes, things like setbacks are really critical. What we're seeing with the initiatives coming out of the province and layered over the city is ultimately reducing the public space, which also, the public and private space, by pushing back on setbacks, from the boundary lines to the building. Things like multiplexes where you get, tower, 4 or 6 stories, and then reduce setbacks, minute adjustment, and then a garden suite. You've got 90% coverage of the lot. So it's not just public space, it's just the feeling of being closeted. relative to the bungalow that was there before. So, I mean, people are really, you know, they're feeling really concerned. And then, you know, it just changes the nature of the, then probably you'll get more and more of those, you know, it just spreads like a, so are we looking at public space in a broader sense? Setbacks are important. It's for the environment, for nature, for space, for shadow issues, just, you know, air movement.
Yeah, well, you guys should answer, but I just, first thought is, it seems like the problem is that it's an outlier. What if the entire street transformed like that, and you have a street in North York that then looks like a Brooklyn street and has like corner stores in the middle of it? It strikes me as it's a matter of degree and contrast, but yeah, what do the planners think?
I think it was me that recommended all of those policies, so I should probably take that question. I think that, fundamental in my view to kind of, is that, heritage, in some cases, heritage is about preserving something in its whole, in its entirety, that, we're probably sitting in one of those examples right now. Most of the time, I think what heritage is about is just making sure that the past is part of the future, and some of those spaces and buildings that we cherish are part of the future. It's not about freezing a place in time, and this is certainly a big topic in a lot of the suburban areas in the city. Is how do you recognize the fact that we have a very strong need for housing, that in many of these neighborhoods we're actually seeing population decline? This is something that people don't necessarily always appreciate. Toronto's a very fast-growing city. Yes, it's true, but it's not evenly growing. Something like 93% of the population growth in the last census period was in 4 wards in the city. And yet we have other areas of the city where we're either seeing stagnation or population decline, and then that's leading to things like the pressures to close some of these smaller schools. So the question for me is not about freezing something in amber. It's about saying, okay, how do we introduce new housing opportunities, new places for people to live in these neighborhoods, but also still think about those aspects of the character that can be part of that change. And we're trying to do some work right now in that in city planning, in that looking not at saying, well, okay, the character is a bungalow, therefore everything must be a bungalow. We're going to have other issues if that's the approach we take. What we're trying to say is, okay, but are there some aesthetic cues, some architectural cues that we can pick up from the neighborhood that can be part of the evolution, that can be part of the design of a multiplex, for example? There, I think, I think we are starting to see some builders who are sensitive to that, some who aren't. But I think it is about growth, it is about evolution, and it is about change. It's how that change is managed.
Yes. A question for each of the speakers. We've talked a lot about heritage and public space. I'm curious, what is one space in Toronto, public space in Toronto, that you think we're not paying enough attention to, that we need to figure out how to better serve or make part of our future? And I'm sure each one of you has one that you know.
I'll start with Hanlon's. Hanlon's Point on Toronto Island. I think there was a question earlier, Alessandro, about how do we ensure, or something related to diversity, and I think it's important that our heritage that we are protecting protects different, or shares stories of different communities, and that is an incredibly important space to Toronto's queer history, and it is a challenging space to protect because it's a beach, and it's a lot of what we're talking about, cultural landscape. So I think that's something that there's a lot of excellent effort right now. I don't want to diminish that. Friends of Hanlon's is doing amazing work. I've been to some workshops by professors at U of T who are doing research on this. So it's certainly not that it's getting no attention, but I think it could be getting even more.
I'll jump on. So Steph, earlier you talked about the idea of moving the Oculus to Trinity Bellwoods. Trinity Bellwoods is the first park that came up in my mind in relation to the question. And I should also mention, I don't live in Toronto anymore, so maybe amazing things are happening in Trinity Bellwoods, but I worry about parks like Trinity Bellwoods and a lot of other kind of neighborhood parks, because of just how much the density of use that's happening, which is obviously a great thing. But as a landscape architect, I think a lot about soil and compaction of soil, and the trees in these landscapes are, like Allan Gardens is similar, like massively important to the heritage and character of these places. And I think we're still figuring out in Toronto how to have these amazing landscape settings, but accommodate the amount of use that is happening in this rapidly densifying city, especially in parts of the city that see all of that use. So that's an example that comes to mind, but it's a stand-in for many examples of we just need to get better at managing. We need to be thinking about soil, and we need to get used as a public to seeing parks where there's a whole zone that's being decompacted and being fertilized, and we're not able to go on it for a little while. We need to evolve, I think, how we make our public spaces to allow us to have these environments, but also to manage them over time.
I have two. I'm going to cheat and I'm going to give two answers. To the part of the question about spaces that could be doing much more, I think our civic squares could be doing much more. Mel Lastman and Nathan Phillips and Scarborough Civic Center, these are potentially really grand spaces. They were designed to be grand spaces, and I think they could be doing much more for their respective communities. To the part of the question of spaces that we maybe, again, could be doing much more and we maybe don't think about enough is just streets. Like, we do really need to think differently about many of our streets. We're doing a lot of work right now we're doing in some of the new districts in the city, so on the waterfront, up at Downsview, where we're kind of having an opportunity to think about streets from scratch, and actually think about what does it mean to think about a street as being not a conduit for the movement of people or vehicles, but as a public space and an essential public space in the city. I think that's an area where, because there's just so much potential as you think about that is actually where most of our public space is in the city, and what more could we be doing with it?
I'd go for Clarence Square.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh gosh, okay. Clarence Square, because it's actually a Georgian square. It was designed before Queen Victoria took over. It was a Georgian square. So if you go to London, some of the most beautiful spaces are these squares that are developed, the same age as Clarence Square, right? The same age. And they're beautiful, and they because you have that square, it makes it a fantastic place to live around, to be near. Clarence Square is half a dog park, for Christ's sake. It's ridiculous. It's actually ridiculous. And it's really unfortunate that it's in such a diminished state. And I think that's where public space really needs to be recognized, revered, and respected, because we get the more out of it if we do that. We place value in it. And I find that's a particularly nasty circumstance. Not that I don't like dogs, but maybe dogs need their own parks. Maybe we need to create new parks that are for dogs only.
I'll also cheat and I'll say a type of space, which is the parking lot. I think we need to be thinking about our parking lots differently, downtown, but also in all the strip malls outside of the downtown core, where the parking lots are really critical for social activity. And so how do we design them? They're overlooked. They don't have any public infrastructure. How do we think about designing them for the kind of public life that they already facilitate and foster?
Since Michael said Clarence Square, I'll go with the waterfront as a whole, I think. Michael and I are involved in an initiative called Art Equals Waterfront, which is about promoting cultural spaces across the entire waterfront, like from eastern Scarborough through downtown all the way to western Etobicoke. And I grew up in Richmond Hill, and something that always held a lot of power for me was the fact that Dufferin Street was the same Dufferin Street up there as it was down at Dufferin and King and Yonge Street and Bathurst and Bayview and all of these streets. There was a feeling of connection with the rest of the kind of urban footprint, and I think that the waterfront could also be that for the suburbs along the waterfront, or along the lake. And much more of it could be public. Obviously, it's a complex affair, but there's something really special about being able to traverse the city in that way, and that would open up opportunities for all kinds of great things to happen there. So I'd say that.
We could talk about Exhibition Place.
Exhibition Place.
Yikes.
I think that's sort of all we have time for. That's also a nice way to end.
Cut it.
Well, the exhibition place,
Can't talk
they
about
announced a big
waterfront.
development there, which we should all get a drink and talk about. But thank you very much indeed. That was a great conversation. Thanks to you all for coming. And so there's food, there's drinks, there's access to the beautiful gardens, and stick around. Please join me in thanking our speakers.